Michael Reynolds believed, for a moment, that he had reached the end of the labyrinth. The scarf was still in his locker, the intercom had gone silent, and Caroline had not appeared in nearly 2 weeks. He took this silence as an answer, a bitter relief that maybe all of it, the whispers, the impossible footage, the girl speaking in that foreign tongue, had been no more than the residue of exhaustion, trauma cracking through the thin walls of his mind. He convinced himself that the mystery was solved not by discovery, but by dismissal. You imagined it, he whispered into his own reflection one night, as though saying it aloud would put the ghosts back into the walls. But deep down, the part of him that still woke in cold sweats at the sound of ash crackling knew he was lying to himself. He wanted the lie. He wanted the false resolution. For a short time, he even let himself believe it. The school district announced that the missing child had been found safely. No details given, no press coverage. Just a single line buried in a newsletter parents almost never read. Student located, no further action required. Michael read it 3 times, his heart climbing into his throat each time the words passed over him. It should have felt like closure, but instead, it felt staged, like a curtain falling too early on a play with no ending. He asked around teachers' staff, even the night security guard, but nobody seemed to recall the panic. The search, the long hours when her name was whispered down hallways. It was as though she had never been missing at all. A mystery uncovered, but not solved. He stood in the empty cafeteria late that night, rereading the line again, hearing Carolina's voice echo in his memory. What if the child isn't missing, and never was? For the first time, he wondered if she had been telling the truth. But the human mind clings to resolution, even a false one, like a lifeboat in black water. Michael carried on with his work. He swept, he mopped, he gathered trash bags heavy with forgotten lunches and broken pencils. He spoke to no one, and was spoken to even less. And yet, that's when he began to notice the symmetry, a hidden truth surfacing where no one wanted it. The girl's disappearance was not the first. He remembered faintly, like a dream, half erased by morning, that another student had vanished decades earlier. A boy. The fire had burned away the records, but Michael's mind refused to bury the detail. He remembered his shoes squeaking on wet linoleum, the sound of the fire alarm ringing like a siren through his skull, the smoke choking the hallway. He remembered that same strange hush falling over the crowd outside, when they realized one child had not made it out. And he remembered something even worse, that the boy's name, too, had been spoken in a voice that wasn't supposed to exist. It was during a storm one night that the false resolution crumbled. Lightning had killed the power, leaving only the dull glow of emergency lights to lead him through the deserted school. He walked past the boiler room, trying not to look, trying not to remember. When the emergency speakers crackled alive, he froze. For 10 seconds, there was nothing. Then, in the dark, the sound of breathing, long, slow, and deliberate. Not a child, not Carolyn, something else. And then it spoke, and the sound of that impossible name filled the hall. Only this time, Michael recognized it instantly. It wasn't the girl's name, it wasn't the boy's, it was his own. That was the moment he knew he had not reached the end. At all. The false resolution collapsed under its own weight, leaving him with a deeper horror. He had been the one missing. The memories he carried weren't whole, they were grafted, stitched together from pieces of other people's stories. Like someone had taken a knife to his past and rearranged it so he would never recognize the truth. His life was a memory glitch, a carefully curated record that skipped over the parts that didn't align. And yet, the cracks were showing. Because in the moments when he was most tired, when his eyes burned from bleach, and his back ached from bending, he swore he remembered being on the other side of that boiler room door, not the rescuer, the child waiting in the dark. Caroline appeared again, but her presence only deepened the fracture. This time she didn't speak in riddles. She didn't taunt him with questions. She only placed a single photograph on the counter. Black and white. Blurred around the edges, a group of children lined up outside the school, ash on their clothes, smoke behind them, and their front row, center, was Michael, only, not as he was now, not the janitor, a child, his own eyes staring back at him from a face he had no memory of. He told himself it was a trick, a forgery, some old photo tampered with to push him into collapse. But as his fingers traced the image, as his chest tightened, he knew, the past was circling back. The missing wasn't missing at all, it had been waiting. The disturbing event from the past mirrored the present with cruel precision. The fire, the missing boy, the whispers in a language that shouldn't exist. He had lived it once, but from the other side, and now it was happening again. Only the roles had shifted. The child rescued, the janitor forgotten. The truth behind what no one tells you. Sometimes you're not the witness, you're the offering. And Michael began to see what had been watching from the beginning. Not with eyes, not with form, but with attention. It had been there the night of the fire. It had been there when the girl whispered the impossible name. It had been there when Caroline showed him the footage that erased him. A presence that was less a figure than a weight in the air. A pressure behind the eyes. A hand on the back of the neck. Something that remembered him when he didn't remember himself. The false resolution cracked for good the night he went back to the boiler room. He told himself he was going to prove it, to open the door, to find nothing inside, to end this madness once and for all. His keyring shook in his hand as the lock clicked. The door opened with a groan, and the stale air rushed out like a breath held for decades. He stepped inside. Darkness, dust, the smell of scorched wood, nothing else. Relief swelled in him. He had done it. He had disproved the lie. He turned to leave, but then his eyes caught on the far wall. Carved into the blackened brick, faint but undeniable, was a single name. His name, not written once, but hundreds of times, layered over each other, as though someone or something had been waiting for him to come back and see it. And here's the twist. The thing that forces you to replay everything you've heard. When he touched the wall, when his fingers traced the grooves, the dust fell away. Beneath the soot was not his name at all. It was the girls. It was the boys. It was every missing name, shifting and bleeding into one another, as though they were all the same person, the same life recycled through time. His memory of rescuing her, her voice whispering his name, Caroline's questions, they weren't fragments. They were reflections. Layers of the same story played again and again, until he could no longer tell which one belonged to him. And the deeper force, whatever it was, laughed without sound. Not from the wall, not from the speakers, but from inside his own head. The truth uncovered was this. Michael hadn't been living a mystery. He had been replaying one. Over and over, until he forgot who he really was. So ask yourself, if the same story keeps happening, if the same children vanish, if the same names are whispered, what role do you play when your turn comes? Witness, victim, or the one who disappears so the others can go on pretending they're safe? Because maybe Michael was never the janitor at all. Maybe he was the missing child who never made it out of the fire. And maybe the real hidden truth is this. You've been living with the same memory glitch too, only you've been trained not to recognize it. Michael Reynolds had convinced himself the haunting belonged to him alone, that the voices in the vents and the carved names in the boiler room were the punishment of a fractured memory, a private hell looping back on itself. But then came the letters. They weren't delivered to his locker or slipped under his apartment door. No. They appeared in the strangest places, hidden in the folds of his routine. A note written inside the wrapper of a cafeteria sandwich he had unwrapped one lonely night. The words pressed into the foil. Asterisk, you were right all along. Another scrawled in chalk beneath the bleachers in the gym. A message no janitor would ever miss, because he was the only one who cleaned their asterisk. They rewatching how you remember. Each message was signed the same way, 3 overlapping circles, faintly resembling a child's drawing of eyes. At first, he dismissed them as pranks. But the handwriting was eerily familiar, like his own, but written by a version of himself that had lived longer, suffered more, and lost track of the years. He kept the scraps, folding them into his wallet, telling himself they were clues. The truth behind what no one tells you is that paranoia docenti start with shadows in the dark. It begins with symbols that feel too personal to ignore. And these weren't just warnings, they were confirmations. Proof that he wasn't the only one unraveling. Soon, the dreams started, not his own, but shared. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, only to find the exact same dream described in another note the next day. A hallway, endless and humming, lined with lockers that never opened. A door at the far end, painted red but bleeding black around the edges. The child standing in front of it, whispering the name he no longer dared to speak aloud. Whoever was sending these messages saw what he saw, slept where he slept, dreamed inside his own head. And for the first time since the fire, he realized he wasn't alone. Others had been watching. Others had been living through it too. The messages grew bolder. One was taped to the underside of his mop handle, hidden where only he would find it after hours of work. Asterisk checked the footage from 20 years ago. And when he snuck into the district's records office late at night and pulled the old tapes, he discovered something he could never explain away. The fire that had destroyed the West Wing was caught on camera. Flames, smoke, screaming children, teachers pushing through the chaos. But in one corner of the frame, barely visible through the smoke, stood a group of figures. Not teachers, not students. Still, calm, and watching. Their faces blurred, their bodies stiff, their presence undeniable. When the fire alarm cut through the air, they didn't flinch. When children screamed, they didn't move. They simply observed, as if waiting. And the strangest part, on the footage from decades ago, one of the figures turned their head just enough to reveal a jawline Michael knew too well, his own. It was then that identity became a fragile thing, splintering under the weight of too much evidence. He had thought he was a man haunted by children's voices, but what if he was nothing more than one layer of an old story, repeating? What if he had been on both sides, all along, the rescuer and the missing, the janitor and the child, the victim and the witness? Caroline's words came back like poison in his ears. Asterisk, what if the child, isn't missing, and never was? The more he stared at the footage, the more he felt the lines blur. Maybe the child had always been him. Maybe he had been watching his own disappearance his whole life. The notes kept coming, slipped between the pages of library books he never checked out, carved into the underside of desks he cleaned, even burned into the dust on an abandoned window. They began to carry instructions. Asterisk look behind the boiler door again. Asterisk count the tiles in the east hallway. Asterisk stop trusting Carolyn. He obeyed some and ignored others, but each one made him feel less like he was uncovering the mystery and more like he was being guided through a labyrinth someone else designed. Memory glitches became daily occurrences, walking into rooms that weren't arranged the way he remembered, hearing teachers call him by a different name, finding that his own handwriting on old forms didn't match the way his hand moved now. Then came the third perspective, the one that felt less like intrusion and more like intrusion disguised as truth. It arrived not as a letter, but as a tape, slipped into his locker in a battered VHS case. No label, no explanation. The footage played like static at first, then resolved into the image of a room he had never seen but recognized instantly. Walls painted a pale green, a clock frozen at 2:17, a hospital bed pressed against the far wall. And there he was, lying in the bed, wires attached to his temples, eyes moving beneath closed lids, as though locked in some endless dream. A voice, calm and heavy with authority, spoke over the image. Asterisk, he is stable. He continues to construct narratives. Observe the consistency of symbols. The fire, the child, the boiler room, memory intact despite intervention. And then silence, as though whoever recorded it wanted him to sit with the horror of what he had just heard. The tape ended. But he knew what it meant. It meant that he wasn't the only one. It meant that others had been watching, not for weeks, not for months, but for decades. That the letters, the dreams, the footage, they weren't random fragments. They were signals, and whoever left them wasn't just reaching out. They were trapped too. Victims in the same loop, shouting into the same void, begging the next version of themselves to see what they couldn't. That night, as he walked through the halls, he noticed the symbols carved into the walls weren't fading anymore. They were multiplying. Circles within circles, eyes that seemed to move when he looked away. Every surface of the school began to feel alive, pulsing with secrets he wasn't meant to uncover. And for the first time, he understood that the presence watching him had never been invisible. It had simply been hiding behind his own reflection, waiting for him to recognize it. The larger force could not be named, because names gave shape, and this thing thrived in silence, in unspoken recognition. But it had always been there, feeding on the gaps in memory, planting images, ensuring the loop continued. And now, with every symbol, every dream, every note, Michael began to see what the others already knew, that this was not a haunting, it was a program, an experiment, a rehearsal that never ended. The final note appeared where he least expected it, folded into the lining of his own jacket. The handwriting, his handwriting, though slanted like someone had written it under duress. Asterisk, you're not crazy, they lied to you. We've all lived this before. The question is not why the child was taken. The question is why you keep coming back. Asterisk, Michael stood in the hallway, the lights flickering above him, the note shaking in his hand. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from the walls themselves, but before he could, he felt it. Not a sound, not a shadow, just the unbearable pressure of something leaning closer, something that had been listening to every breath, every thought, something waiting for him to acknowledge it. And here's the truth that forces everything you've seen to rewind in your mind. The note didn't end there. Beneath the final line, barely visible, were words that didn't belong to him at all. Words that looked older, heavier, written by a hand that wasn't his. Asterisk, we're still watching. And this time, you're not the janitor. Would you like me to continue into the next chapter where the audience themselves become implicated, where the story begins, leaving clues directly for them, forcing them to question if they're also trapped inside the same cycle? Michael Reynolds stood at the edge of the boiler room, the note still trembling in his hand, and felt the terrible weight of years pressing against his ribs. The air was thick, not with dust or smoke, but with the sensation that every choice he had ever made, every floor mopped, every glance avoided, every memory stitched together had been leading him to this exact moment. And for the first time, the question tearing him apart wasn't what happened here. It was why me? Why had he been chosen to carry these fractured pieces of memory, to live through the same vanishing, the same whispers, the same cycle of being both rescuer and victim? When he finally confessed it aloud, his voice cracked like an old tape. I was there when the boy disappeared. I didn't help him. The words spilled out as if someone else had been waiting to speak through him. The memory that surfaced was not the fire, not the chaos of children screaming, but something quieter, heavier. He remembered standing in the hall with the boy, a boy whose face looked too much like his own. He remembered the whisper sliding into the air like smoke. Asterisk, come with me. He remembered turning away. He had always told himself it was the smoke that blinded him, the fire that blocked his path. But the truth was uglier. He hadn't tried. He had left the boy behind, and now the world itself was punishing him by replaying that moment. Again and again, through other lives, other faces, other missing names. Carolyn found him there, knees buckled, words tumbling like glass. She didn't argue, she didn't deny, she only knelt beside him and whispered, "It's not about what happened. It's about whether you believe you deserve to live with it." Her voice carried no authority this time, only a kind of exhausted compassion that frightened him more than her cold questions ever had. Because in her eyes he saw she was trapped too, repeating her own loop, playing her role until the edges of her humanity frayed. And maybe that was what bound them. Not answers, not clarity, but the unbearable weight of guilt. The walls around him seemed to breathe, the carved names shimmering like water under dim light. He understood, suddenly, that the force watching him had no interest in truth. It wasn't feeding on facts, it was feeding on his choice. Would he allow the cycle to continue by denying what he had done, or would he finally stand inside the unbearable grief of it? That was the awakening. That was the point. The why wasn't about children vanishing or fires breaking out. It was about the human need to bury our sins so deep that we mistake the echoes for ghosts. Michael pressed his palm to the wall, feeling the grooves of 1,000 names that could have been his, that maybe were his. His chest ached, his throat raw. "It was me," he whispered. "It was always me." The confession split him open, a moment of total vulnerability that left him shaking but strangely alive, as though the act of naming his own betrayal gave the presence less room to hide. For the first time, the voices in the vents fell silent. The speakers stopped humming. The loop seemed to stutter. He realized then the truth might save him, but only if he could live with the ruin of it. But what if he couldn't? What if admitting it only fed the cycle, made the force stronger, dragged another version of him into the same labyrinth? This was the choice, to believe confession was liberation, or to believe it was a trap. His entire identity hung on that razor's edge, and the weight of being human, the need for meaning, the fear of oblivion crushed down on him. He lifted his eyes to Caroline, but her face had blurred, as if she was never truly there, only a projection of his guilt. Or perhaps she was more real than he had ever been. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he felt something shift inside himself, not an answer but an awakening. He saw the cycle for what it was, not punishment, not salvation, but a mirror. And in that mirror, he wasn't just the janitor, or the child, or the witness. He was the choice itself. The camera of memory pulled back, showing him standing alone in the hall, the names on the wall flickering like static, the scarf at his feet turning to ash. It no longer mattered whether the girl had been real, or the boy, or even the fire. What mattered was that the weight he had been running from all his life was finally pressing down, demanding he decide whether to carry it, or vanish beneath it. And here's the part you need to sit with. If the loop has been repeating, if the same faces keep returning, if the same story keeps being told, then maybe it isn't just Michael's story at all. Maybe it's yours too. Maybe the reason you feel uneasy hearing it is because some part of you remembers. A hallway, a fire, a missing name, a choice you never admitted to making. You were right all along. They did lie to you. The truth isn't hidden, it's etched inside you, waiting for the moment you can finally bear to see it. Michael exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and stepped deeper into the boiler room. The door closed behind him without a sound. The lights flickered once, then steadied. And for a moment, it felt like waking from a dream you didn't know you were in, terrifying, raw, irreversible. And just before the screen went black, the faintest whisper bled through the silence. Not his voice, not Caroline's, not the child's. A voice you know, though you cannot place it, saying, "You have always been here." Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.